Bernie Gonzalez, and in these videos, I like to go over some of the comics, TV shows, art books that have influenced my comic book art, my storytelling. And in this video, I'm going over the Uncanny X-Men Trading Cards Complete Series book. This was published by Abrams Comics Art in 2022. It collects all 105 trading cards that were originally drawn by Jim Lee back in 1992. So a bit of a walk down memory lane, nostalgia lane, because I was getting into comics in the early 90s, and I was starting to, really understand that there were different artists that do different books, and that it wasn't just all the same, and that I actually enjoyed some artistic interpretations of some of my favorite characters, of Wolverine, of Spider-Man, of Batman, when it was drawn by certain artists. Jim Lee was certainly one of them. If you were into comics in the 90s, X-Men Jim Lee were on every comic book store shelf, pull box, every Walgreens magazine section. And just 1 year before, 1991, before the trading card set was released in 92, in 1991, X-Men #1, penciled by Jim Lee, had sold over 8 million copies. So I think it may be still the #1 single American best-selling comic book. It had those 4 interconnecting covers A, B, C, and D, that featured the X-Men. Last one featured Magneto. All of them in full Jim Lee action posed 4-color glory. And it was glorious, especially when you saw the gatefold cover that combined everything. X-Men was a bestseller, and following in the Friendly Neighborhoods Webheads lead, which had Amazing and Spectacular Spider-Man, there was Adjectiveless Spider-Man, and that was released in 1990, and the sales were, well, they were amazing. So Marvel tried the same formula with the X-Men. So they lose the Uncanny, they break up the Merry Mutants into blue and gold teams, and bring in top-notch creative teams. All right, well, who is that? Chris Claremont as the writer, Jim Lee as the artist. Jim Lee had worked on Alpha Flight, on Punisher, and in 1989, I believe, he'd filled in for what at the time was the regular X-Men artist, Mark Silvestri. Jim Lee did a few arcs. I think it was Acts of Vengeance. And ultimately, he became the series' ongoing artist with issue 261 that came out September 1990. And then in 1991, they lost X-Men Volume 2 without the adjectives, 100% Jim Lee. Then going into 1992, riding the wave of popularity with Jim Lee's artwork and the X-Men and the whole trading card fad, because trading cards were a big thing in the 90s. Collectibles, comics, trading cards, both of them massive phenomenons. So Marvel commissions Lee to do the artwork, to draw the art for this new card set. And a bit of context before we kind of dig into this. You have to remember at the time, 1990, there was the Marvel Universe card set, 162 cards. In 91, set 2 comes out, artwork with Art Adams, cards with Art Adams artwork, Jim Lee, Eric Larson. And then later in 92, you get the Marvel Masterpiece set with cards painted by Joe Jusko. But for this, Marvel just put everything right at the top. You've got Jim Lee, #1 selling comic book artist at the time on the #1 book, and he's working on a full trading card set featuring just his artwork and creating 100+ card set of his art. So this book collects all the cards, front and back, and then you can see here in the beginning, you get a bit of a prologue that explains the production, the creation of this card set, features some of Jim Lee's artwork, some behind the scenes. A good chunk of them were probably, I believe, inked by Scott Williams. I think Jim Lee may have actually done the inks on some of them, and they were colored by Paul Mounts. So you can see, what the package of the cards look like, the front and back. And again, the great thing about this book is that if you did not have these, which I certainly did when I was buying the cards, had to buy them all, chase cards, the holograms, everything. But over time, you lose them, you give them to someone, you don't get them back. They just don't have the attachment that they had at the time. So when this was released, I couldn't pick it up fast enough because this was a way to get the cards back into my collection without having the binders and still being able to see the cards in their full glory, because they're reproduced at a case where that's about the actual size of the card. And then we also get a little bit of a commentary on some of these cards. So just kind of flip through some of these, because again, the showcase here is Jim Lee's artwork, and that Marvel Universe Set 2 did have some artists that I was starting to recognize. Like, again, I said Art Adams, Jim Lee, of course, Eric Larson, who drew Spider-Man, and he was working on Spider-Man, the comic book series at the time. But to have a whole series of Jim Lee drawn X-Men cards at a time when X-Men could not have been more popular. I mean, this was amazing. Jim Lee, who was influenced by John Byrne, Neil Adams, Frank Miller, Kevin Nolan, Whilce Portacio, who was a contemporary of his, who would eventually join him when was in 1992. You get the 6 artists who go and form Image. Jim Lee creates, was it Wildcat, Stormwatch, Deathblow, Gen 13, under his publishing name Wildstorm. But that's all the future. At the present, you get this in 1992, 105 cards that feature everything X, and that also includes Excalibur, which I was not as familiar with, and at the time, sure, I was buying Uncanny, X Factor, everything that had an X in it I was buying. Excalibur was a bridge too far, was not as interesting to me. But when you see what Jim Lee was doing in these cases, and again, you got to give credit to Scott Williams, to Paul Mounts for the work that they did, but you just got that the face and the way he did the shadow. That is, any kid who was buying comics in the 90s that had a sketchbook, that had a notebook that was filled with artwork, and you were just copying poses. I mean, you learned to draw noses from Jim Lee. You learned to draw weaponry from Jim Lee, pouches, feet, everything, because it was just, his artwork was so stunning. It was lively. There was motion. Sure, again, his inspirations, Byrne, Adams, those were artists that are, Mount Rushmore, of course. But as a kid in the 90s, I wasn't appreciating Buscema or Kirby. I was looking at Liefeld, at McFarlane, at Jim Lee, and these guys were rocking my world. They were, I was looking at comics in a different way, not always necessarily for the story. Sometimes it was strictly for the art. And when, X-Men number 1, volume 2 comes out, I'm buying every issue the day it's released, forcing my parents to take me to the comic shop because I don't want to miss out on, sure, the story's okay, but on the Jim Lee artwork. And then we get introduced to, he created Gambit in Uncanny, brings him into the X-Men series, certainly into the card set. And we get the adventures of Gambit. We get introduced to characters like Omega Red in the series. And this card set just featured all of these characters. And you can see in cases like this where, it may seem not as obvious how he was inspired by Frank Miller, but certainly in Deathblow and in some of these just little inking nods, there's a little bit of a nod to Miller in trying to replicate how Miller used blacks, used inking in his compositions, and you could tell that Jim Lee is kind of working through some of this. And there are ways in this where I see a lot of Mark Texeira in this artwork, in the weight of the ink lines, not only in the power, but in the inking of Jean Grey in the side here in the shadow where she's lit here from the side from her powers. And, I'm thinking it's Jim Lee, who's worked on Alpha Flight, who's worked on Punisher War Journal, I believe it was. He's still kind of finding his way as an artist. But when you were trying to draw Rubble, certainly when I was looking at this because I couldn't fathom, I couldn't wrap my head around what he was doing. In some ways, it was insanely simple if you just looked at it, but it wasn't easy to replicate. All you could do was copy it. But if someone told me, can you draw that Rubble from a different angle? No way. I had no clue what I was doing. So just kind of neat because this hardcover collects the whole set, front and back. It's like 270 pages. So that beginning prologue goes into the creation, the production, the popularity. I appreciate the context and the history, but to be able to see characters like Shatterstar and Strong Guy and see it in the glorious Jim Lee art, love it, love it. Again, Excalibur, not as interesting to me, but when you have a character like Forge that was kind of cool because you had the cybernetic leg, had the pouches, had the guns, had all of this machinery, all this stuff, but then drawn by Jim Lee this fantastically. I mean, come on, it just makes a character like Forge, like Multiple Man, who's got the trench coat going here, just makes them that much cooler. Makes a character, unfortunately, like Quicksilver just look kind of old and dated when you have someone with a cool leather jacket on like Rogue or Cyclops did at the time. And then when you see characters like this, like Widget, I'm like, I have no clue who the hell this is. But I do know who Bishop is, and with his full Jerry curl on full display, got the psychic powers there, and got the cool looking gun. Amazing. Maverick, a character that debuted in the adjectiveless X-Men series. I want to say maybe it was like issue 4 or 5, giving a little bit more history into the Weapon X universe, into Wolverine's background. And not only did you get the front cover, but you got this little profile image also drawn by Jim Lee in the back. And yes, you would get like this scale here, energy projection, mental powers, strength, fighting ability. So obviously he's maxing out on fighting ability. Energy projection is nothing. Intelligence is a little low versus, say, Cersei here. And then you get someone like Magneto. Let's take a look at his energy projection, almost maxed out. Intelligence, super high. Mr. Sinister, again, you could see Jim Lee playing around with this. And, you know, he's working on the comic series. He's working on this card set, all 105 cards, likely at the same time. So he's trying to find time when he can to do this. And I'm sure allows him the ability to experiment, to play around with some of these designs. And then you get some straightforward designs like this, like Deadpool on the top of a city. It works, it's fine. But then you get something like this, like Proteus, where you get some caricature, some cartoony drawing by Jim Lee, where he gets to have a little fun. Proteus, who has the ability to distort reality, I believe, is starting to distort the shapes of Wolverine and Nightcrawler. So, you know, as a kid, you're looking at this, and I'm like, I don't remember who Mojo 2 is, but look at that Juggernaut. The way that the ink lines work to denote the bricks, to give it energy, to give it motion, you gotta love it. Flip through some of these here. Shiva, I remember, was it Wolverine issue number 50 that with the ripped cover drawn by Silvestri that had a character called the Professor, I believe, and the idea was that, you know, this was again showing more background into Wolverine and the Weapon X project. Characters like Mojo, where you had that other cosmic universe in X-Men with the Shi'ar, all this other stuff that I wasn't necessarily as interested in, but still, Jim Lee made it look cool. Characters like Strife, so well known from Liefeld's run on X-Force, and now interpreted by Jim Lee, and looking badass as ever. Omega Red, a character that I believe he created, big part of that initial, first few issues of X-Men Volume 2, and just, again, a little background into a character that had connections to Wolverine from a Cold War era, but just looked very cool. There you go. X-Men number 4, January 92. Hellfire Club, Black Tom. Sauron, got a Mystique card there. White Queen, that's one of the other things about Jim Lee, is that he also had a knack and ability to draw women incredibly sexy, with sometimes unrealistic posing, unrealistic physiques, but nevertheless, prepubescent kid. Looking at some of this, it was amazing. Lady Deathstrike, the way he would draw the claws is great. Not 100% sure about the background. Paul Mounts, who did the coloring on it, explains how there was some wrapping paper that he got his hands on, and he used it to kind of experiment with some of these. And in some cases, 100% works. In others, looks a little weird. You get the team cards that show all the characters, including some of the teams like Excalibur, Hellfire Club. And again, the landscape format is neat because I'm sure as much as it was a way to feature more characters, I have to imagine as an artist, this is a challenge for Jim Lee because he's got to put all of these characters on one card, and he's got to find the right composition, the right tone, the right angle that can get all of these characters on one card and still keep them, looking heroically, looking amazing, and then pulling it off in the final composition. And again, outside of some characters that were from early Excalibur that just didn't care for, he doesn't for about like 95% of this card series. Characters like Magic that just look amazing. Don't know anything about her at the time, but it made me want to learn more about her. About Dazzler, a character that for me was very much a like 70s, 80s Marvel character that was into like disco, but all of a sudden now she looks like a combination of Jubilee and Forge. And I don't know what Dazzler is about, but very cool. Starjammers, more of the cosmic Marvel X-Men universe, but things like the Imperial Guard, Leandra, the Shi'ar, all of those were characters that were made interesting because of Jim Lee's interpretation. Then you get this set here where if you put them all together and you connected them all, it was this Danger Room sequence. You get Professor X looking over his students as they are practicing in the Danger Room. And if you put all of them together, you would get this full card set that I believe, while not featured there, Abrams Comics Publishing, who also did the Garbage Pail Kids collection, and they featured some exclusive cards in that collection as well. That one collected series 1 through 5 of the Garbage Pail Kids, and in this one you get the set, some exclusive cards that collects the covers, but there's that full Danger Room set right here. So kind of neat to see that now you actually get it as a card instead of collecting all 9 cards to make it up, which would still be kind of cool because if you had it in a binder, it would kind of show off the full image. You get, of course, the checklist, so that way you can make sure you would get them all. I don't know about you, but I kept these cards in as pristine condition as I could. Obviously, it was putting comics in back in boards. I was looking at Wizard magazine. I was starting to understand that some of these comics were almost like collectibles, and just like everyone else around me, I was starting to realize that maybe I should keep them in better condition. Same with the comics in bags and boards, same as with the cards. So I was starting to put them in those plastic containers, trying to, save them for, of course, paying off my college or my house. Didn't pan out, but I remember having the checklist and certainly not daring to mark off the cards that I had. Then you also had these different hologram cards that, again, had to have been really interesting. The comment that they make here for the hologram cards, Jim Lee needed to draw different layers separately, and the version you see on the back is a complete drawing, but that needed to be separated into 3 layers to make the hologram: foreground, midground, background. It was difficult. So you can see the image there and what he was able to do with characters like Cable, Gambit, Magneto, certainly going with well-beloved characters, a little bit of a group shot here with the X-Men. Here's that Danger Room set complete. Again, love this book. Just the collection feels amazing. Even the cover here, the dust cover, has the feeling a little bit of a velvety, kind of like matte, like the wax packs that you would see in some of the trading card sets at the time. Again, it's just kind of neat to be able to get all of this because having lost my cards, trading cards, original cards that I'd bought, literally buying them and seeing these ads at comic shops, at stores, and grabbing a pack or two whenever I could, going to the comic shop and getting my comics and trying to sneak the cards at a time when you can kind of see here, the cards were a big deal. Trading cards were incredibly popular. The one that stood out to me was always the Uncanny X-Men trading card set by Jim Lee. So hope you enjoyed the videos. If you haven't seen the cards out in the wild, this is a great substitute if you don't want to go hunting them down. But great collection, great book, great reproduction, highly recommended. Thanks for checking out the video.